central Mongolia, and is a typical herder's home with sheep pen and so on. This individual guided us up a mountain. We did a lot there for 2 weeks. We did a lot of mountain climbing, looking for birds and other such things. So many of you will remember the various papers I've given here before on the Huihui Yaofang, amazing encyclopedia of Mongol ethnobiology from the 14th century. It's a medical manual. It was a medical encyclopedia that was put together under the Mongol Empire, and it was about 3,500, 4,000 pages long, of which 500 pages survived. It's in classical Chinese, but with Persian and Arabic names for the drugs and so on. And it appears to be a translation of some lost Central Asian work or works, or edited up from lost Central Asian works. Mostly, basically going back to Avicenna, who was this amazing Central Asian doctor of the 11th century. Anyway, here's the same home, and the guy's flock, sheep and goats, lots of sheep and goats. You can see the landscape has been fairly well gone over by sheep and goats, but believe it or not, that's not really overgrazing. These are very carefully managed animals. They're pretty careful with the grass. It's just that this area gets like, the valleys there get 3 inches of rain a year. The mountains get higher, we don't have a rain gauge up there, probably a foot. Pretty dry, and it's very, very cold. We had, although this was in May and June that we were there, we had ice on the water occasionally. So this Huihui Yaofang has about 416 medicinals mentioned. Many of them are obscure, we don't know what they are. There's about 381 named categories that we can figure out what they were. That breaks down to 287 plants, 68 animals, and 26 mineral categories. They range from plants where we know that they do have the medical values assigned, such as Artemisia, which kills worms and parasites and cures malaria. Opium, you know what opium does. Mint, which is great at for digestion and soothing, whatever. And then there are animals that were probably strictly magical in their use and supposed values, such as foxes and weasels. An astonishing fact about the Huihui Yaofang is the high percentage of its taxa that have medicinal value in modern bioscientific terms. Some, such as the 3 mentioned, are still in medicinal use. Others, like acacia gum, have only a little value and are now abandoned as serious cures, but they were still officinal into the mid-20th century. So let's see what else there is. Here's the man himself, the owner of that flock. He's about 50-something, and as you can see, he looks about 20. He ran up these 8,000-foot peaks as if they weren't there, and sort of wondered why we were so slow. The guy I was going with was in fantastic shape. So these guys are in better shape. What passes for a water course there, this is kind of typical. This also is the road that we were taking. It's kind of hard to see it there, but it's in there somewhere. Needless to say, we had a 4-wheel drive with a Mongol driver. Beautiful flowers. Anyway, the vast majority of the taxa recorded are in other medicinal works of those days. The most important and clearly relevant of things that survive and are translated is Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, the second volume of which is a complete herbal. It discusses 226 of the 381 identifiable things we've got. 182 plants, 32 animals, and 12 minerals. Second, in terms of sharing stuff, is the great Chinese herbal by Li Shizhen, the Buncao Gongmu, which is much later than our encyclopedia. It's 1593, and ours is from about 1330. Anyway, the Buncao Gongmu has about 203 of the 381 taxa we have. Most of the items it lacks are either obscure medical items or are Western drugs that you couldn't get in China. In the West, Dioscorides, the basic source for classical era herbal medicine, mentions most of the major plant drugs in the Huihui Yaofang. Over time, the Arab and Iranian doctors added more to Dioscorides' total. Mongol Lake with various rare birds. There's all kinds of incredibly exciting rare birds there. somewhere in that photograph is the relic gull, which breeds only on 4 or 5 lakes in central Mongolia, just across the border to Russia, or Kazakhstan rather. Typical Mongol life, the kids still riding on horses. They will still probably come out and take over the world. Camels, Bactrian camels. The Bactrian camel has been entirely domesticated. I think there's a few surviving wild ones somewhere in the Mongolian deserts, but it's like the dromedary, basically a completely domesticated animal. Any lingering doubts that the Near Eastern, of the genuine Near Eastern roots in the Huihui Yaofang were dispelled when I found accounts from the same time period in the West for this basically the same treatment of stroke. Fortunately, a big chunk of what survives of the Huihui Yaofang is treatment of stroke and related conditions. And fortunately, stroke is pretty easily identifiable. Paralysis of half your body, or something like that. Or you have a sudden paralysis of half your body or some fraction of it. Very identifiable. And easily identifiable in descriptions. And we have a description by a French doctor in the 1300s and an Egyptian doctor in the 1300s. And it's basically the same as the Huihui Yaofang. Same drugs, except stuff that you couldn't get in China at the time. Same methods. Anyway, the steppe area here is a vast corridor of meeting and so on. People managed to get across these deserts going from oasis to oasis and along rivers, oasis corridors. And so ever since the Neanderthals and Denisovans were interbreeding with modern humans up there, we've got lots of contact. So this is an interesting plant. It's a red gobel. It's a cymamorium or something like that. It's one of the broomerae. It's not cymamorium, it's a broomerae of some kind. Anyway, it's a parasite on the roots of this desert shrub. Here's a little desert river. Yes, there's water there. The water flows out of the higher mountains to the north where it's wetter and high. Finally, kind of these, it's like the Great Basin in the U.S. These rivers finally end in big sinks, which are usually lakes. And smudging to keep the mosquitoes off around the fire. Anyway, in the period just, when this book comes from, Central Asia was the leading part of the Western world. Intellectually, in the early Middle Ages, about 600 to 1100 AD, and to some extent on through the 1300s, Central Asia was the happening place worldwide. The great achievements in science and medicine were long just ascribed to the Arabs in a kind of vague general way, or to Islamic civilization. And many of them were largely made by Central Asians who spoke Iranic languages, such as Avicenna and al-Samarkandi, who came somewhat after Avicenna, and al-Bukhari, and a lot of other people. You have the kind of torch of Western civilization basically passed from ancient Greece to the Greek East, from the Greek East to via Syria to northern Arabia and Iran, and then to Central Asia, where in Central Asia, especially in the 700s, 800s, 900s, 1000s, was clearly by far the leading intellectual center of the world in terms of developing medicine, astronomy, technical arts of every kind, mathematics, travel accounts, geography, really quite amazing. It's something which has only been realized recently. I was beginning to realize it myself, just working with this stuff. But recently there are books by Christoph Baumel and Frederick Starr and Christopher Beckwood and a couple of other people that really kind of identified this. So one of the things it had going for it was religious tolerance. The Iranians, Turks, and Mongols were all characterized by a level of religious toleration that was striking even by modern standards. And the pre-Islamic empires, including the Mongol and also the Mongol Empire itself, were completely open to all religions. They were totally tolerant. Islam, coming in the mid-700s, brought a relatively new concept of religious exclusiveness. But in Central Asia, it was only the most liberal and tolerant forms of Islam that were adopted, and you have nothing even remotely resembling what you have now in Islamic countries. That really began with al-Ghazali who lived from 1058 to 1111, and introduced the the original form of the kind of intolerant Islam that you see today, although al-Ghazali was a raving liberal compared to what you have now. Even so, he led to a crackdown and the slow progression of extremist Islam, which has now shut down Central Asia completely. Not totally, but fairly substantially. So anyway, as late as this Mongol Empire occurred, the Mongols were not Muslim. They were completely open to everything. They had religious debates between all the major religions. Of course, famously, Genghis Khan, after listening to a bunch of religious people talk about what is the good and the true and the virtue, said, "You may debate all you well, gentlemen, but to me, the good consists of conquering my enemy, cutting off his head, and pillowing my head on the thighs of his women." Rather doubts if Genghis Khan really said that. It's a good story. You also are not necessarily forced to take on faith the story that Genghis Khan is responsible for 7% of the population of Central Asia. They do share a Y chromosome, but, who knows. See, some more stuff. Typical Mongol rider on a typical Mongol horse. These horses, they look pretty much like wild horses, kind of somewhere between a large pony and a small regular horse, but of course they're tough as nails. They can happily run 30 miles a day forever. Mongol family in yurt, and Turkic word for a ger is the Mongol word, which is one of many proofs that Turkic and Mongol are not related languages contrary to what you may have read in your textbooks. Anyway, this is a ger, and everybody is there, and this looks pretty much like gers 1,000 years ago, but of course the well-equipped ger now inevitably has a solar cell, a motorcycle, and a TV set. And of course everybody has a cell phone. So here you have getting into botany, a wild almond with little almonds on it. There's a couple of species of wild almonds there, which are closely related to the almonds that we have today in Central Asia. And riparian vegetation, river vegetation along the river. Iris, beautiful irises, are beautiful wildflowers in May and June. So anyway, I was in need of going there and taking a look at the place. Oh, I'm afraid I've wandered too far from this video camera to get recorded. Oh well. The current situation, virtually all Mongols outside the city are stock herders, raising sheep, goats, and horses. Yaks are common in the colder mountains, camels are common in hot deserts. These animals comprise the so-called 5 snouts, Tavan Koshu, or Tavan Koshu Mal, 5 snout animals. I love that. These are divided into cold-snouted, sheep, yaks, camels, and warm-snouted, horses and goats. In other words, the more tranquil ones and the more uppity ones. Herders naturally know the plants and animals in their area and medicinal feed plants. They're extremely aware of issues such as overgrazing. They monitor their vast areas of interest with the devoted attention that American vegetable gardeners lavish on their gardens. Overgrazing is now common around Ulaanbaatar, the capital, but once one is more than 20 or 30 miles from the capital, this rapidly changes. Game is not much shot, remains common. We saw many gazelles, foxes, large birds, and so on. Almost any large tree outside the forest is subject to be marked as a sacred grove. There's some, this is possibly the most isolated town in the world. It's the market center of the Mongolian gobi. It's really out in the middle of nowhere. This is typical field conditions. My traveling companion, Doug Futuyma, who's an evolutionary biologist, and our wonderful cook, Segi, and wonderful driver who managed to negotiate this thing over those roads you saw in the earlier picture. Segi was a wonderful kind of girl of nomad background, and managed to learn quite good English, astonishing. And she was my source for the fascinating fact that she liked to collect pretty rocks, but she felt bad about doing it because moving rocks without a reason is disrespectful to the rocks. This is the kind of thing you read about in the old books from Native Americans and so on, but you don't expect to actually find people saying that in the modern world, but they do. Rheum manum, dwarf rhubarb. This is a medicinal herb, good for pretty much what ails you. And here's a sacred tree. You find that many of these trees are marked by these sacred blue scarves, hadag, and this one has gotten a lot of decoration. A lot of these river bottom forests like this, the trees are especially prone to be protected. Now and then you even see a telephone pole that's protected. These hadag are a very traditional thing. They're all over. One of those kind of fascinating linguistic facts that delights a linguistic anthropologist is that one of the reasons they were deluded into thinking that Mongol was related to Turkey is the word for blue, which is in modern Mongol, medieval Turkic dirt. And but it's only for this color of pure heavenly sky blue, the regular word in Mongol for green, blue, gray, the standard East Asian lump category that lumps the green, blue, and gray into one word is Tsenker, translating the Chinese Qing. There's a and so on. And obviously the original word was Tsenker, and then they borrowed it from Turkey when they got into this heavenly thing. It's the color of the sky which is heaven, which is sacred. Before they adopted Buddhism, and even to some extent now, the worship of heaven was the major religious thing. So there's faithful tsegi with a ceremonial cairn, obo, out in the middle of nowhere, complete with the blue wraps around it. These sacred cairns are very important. They mark any sacred site or any place you want to make sacred or protect, and you're supposed to do the proper Buddhist thing of walking around one 3 times clockwise for good luck. So most of this pervasive respect for landscapes, plants, animals, and rocks is really quite amazing. The usual word for respect is shutech. There's also another word which I did not run into, hundlech. An anthropologist named Marissa Smith supplied me with that bit of data. And in Inner Mongolia, the word bishert is used. A Mongol postdoc at our school supplied me with that bit of lore. And it's really quite interesting because these words for respect are all over the place. My Akha student from South China, gave me the word tahe for respect in his language, which has the same concept. It's basically respect for elders and family members, but it's extended to nature. You have this in the New Channel language in British Columbia, which is another language I worked in a little bit. Same thing. Same word for respect was used in the same way. So this is getting to be a more and more interesting thing to be Romanian for that matter. I put out a request on EF Lister for this to find out who was doing this stuff, and got a Romanian answer. I'd like to know if anybody else has this. Here's the fierce Mongolian Mastiff. My wife, who's been in Mongolia, warned me that these fierce Mongolian Mastiffs are very dangerous and protective. They're kind of miniaturized versions of the Tibetan Mastiff. They're not true Mastiffs. They're big sheepdogs. They're very closely related to, Eastern European and Turkish sheepdogs. But as you can see, they're cute, adorable, and friendly. I have extreme difficulty finding dogs who don't like me. Desert landscape, sock salad, this very fascinating desert landscape shrub. This is a little orchard of sea buckthorn. This is a plant with a nice yellow fruit that produces an exquisitely flavored yellow juice, which everybody loves. And so he's protected with a wire fence from the herds of the herder there. And this is modern Ulaanbaatar in typical June weather. And getting up into the taiga, Mongolia goes far enough north to get the south end of the Siberian taiga. So here you've got a Siberian pine forest. This is a white pine with wonderful seeds, which are good to eat, and it's full of rare birds and animals. Getting back into the desert, this is Sinomorium severicum. It's a amazing parasitic plant that lives on the roots of saxal and so on. It's in the family Sinomoriaceae. It's in its own little family. Genus of semi-parasites. Sinomorium means dog snake. And I guess dogs may snack on it, but more commonly camels and humans snack on it. It is horribly bitter and nasty, and you know, you'd have to be starving in the desert to want to eat it, but it is quite edible. You nibbled on it. Back to the mountains in the north. The slides are all out of order. Here's a yak with a baby yak. Again, my wife warned me not to go for the yaks with their babies because they're very fierce. This one is totally changed, of course. Back to the desert mountains, an idea of some of the vegetation that lives along watercourses. This is up at 8,400 feet in the Gobi Altar. No trails. There's a Siberian rock sparrow, or snowfinch. Here I am on top of an 8,400 foot peak there. So that is the end of the slides, thank goodness. And so the interesting thing, the kind of moral, insofar as I can very quickly, I'm running a little over, is our next presenter here, Meenakshi Priyadarshini. Well, I can run over all I want to. Anyway, the interesting thing here is you have here Central Asian medicine from ancient Greek roots, mediated through Syrians, Arabs, and Persians, and then reaching fruition in Central Asia, and then translated under the Mongol Empire into Chinese. And globalization is a new thing that happened only in the last 100 years? Right. Sell me another one. This is so ridiculous. I mean, the most global society in the history of the world was the Mongol Empire. They transferred knowledge all over the place. You know, at the same time that Central Asian medical books are being translated into Chinese medical books were being translated into Persian. We have a surviving translation into Persian of the Maijing, one of the books on how to read your pulse that the Chinese love so much. It's still surviving. There were lots of other translations done. Printing, the compass and gunpowder reached us via the Mongol Empire from China and revolutionized the West. Lots of other things got to China, including wonderful recipes, which Paul Buell and I translated in an earlier work. And so you've got, and of course there was sea trade shortly after the Mongols, and still basically on their initiative. You had Chinese explorers going to Africa and bringing back so many giraffes that one emperor reportedly said he was sick of giraffes and didn't want any more. And so this was a completely globalized society already, as far as the old world goes. The other kind of moral is that you can forget about words like cultural hybridity. Hybrids are different species, right? There was no such thing as separate cultures. They've been mixing and merging forever. There's no sharp boundaries. Anytime you scratch a culture, you find influences from everywhere within transportation distance, and isolation you don't get. And on the other hand, they're not totally open. Mongol, Chinese, Turkic, and Iranic cultures continue to exist and continue to be separate with linguistic differences, obviously. Also, sadly, the Huihui Yaofang led nowhere. The Mongols were expelled by the Chinese, who put in the Ming Dynasty, which was very anti-Mongol for obvious reasons. The Mongols continued to attack China. They sacked Peking in the 1400s. So China decided to learn no more from Central Asia. They get a few little things. There's a couple of Central Asian recipes in a book from the late 1500s. But basically, not much more learning. And China really closed in the late Ming Dynasty and after that. And even though New World food crops were becoming well known, when Li Shichen wrote his Herbal in 1593 that I mentioned, there's no New World food crops in that Herbal. And only 67 Western herbal remedies. So you don't get a totally open situation, but of course that's the same now. I mean, people are still rather intolerant. However, when you think of globalization, which is not a word I like, but if you have to use it, remember it's not new. It started when people got out of Africa, however many years ago. And that cultural hybridity doesn't exist because cultures have never been pure or separate in the first place. So, still no next presenter.